All right, so we'll get started. As I noted in the video released a few days ago, part 3 of our series where we looked at Pony Express and Bridger and the competition for barrels out of the Bakken, was just that there is some dynamics to think about when you are sending your barrel to Cushing, and the risk potentially of sending your barrel of oil to Cushing, Oklahoma, instead of a more liquid market or an export market like the Gulf Coast. So just before we get started, just mention again, please reach out to us if you have any questions. If you want to see anything with the tool, please reach out. The email address will be in the text section of this video on Substack. So just to review what we talked about last video, we were comparing netbacks between the egress options out of the Bakken. As you can see on the slide we used for Pony and Bridger, their joint tariff goes into Cushing, Oklahoma. So we used a Cushing, Oklahoma price. And as I mentioned before, and I'll go to the next slide here, this is a slide we showed on the last video. Historically, if you look back before 2018 or mid-2017, the spread between Cushing, Oklahoma and Houston was very thin. So a small spread, about $1 to $2. There wasn't a huge difference in price whether you were sending your barrel to Houston or Cushing. Now, Houston did have a premium of about $1.50 for that time period. But what we saw and what you see on this graph is that in 2017 through really 2019 intermittently, was that spread blew out quite a bit. And there's a few reasons for that, and we'll definitely go into those. But to go back to that netback analysis that we did, if you're going to sign up for pipeline capacity into a market like Cushing, you need to be sure, or at least reasonably comfortable with your barrel going to a market that's not going to see a blowout like this. So again, this is the premium to Houston over Cushing. What caused this premium was Cushing becoming constrained. So pipeline capacity out of Cushing filled to a lot of the markets getting out of there, and that caused the price to weaken. So that's why you saw a premium for Houston over Cushing. And clearly, if you're shipping into that market, you want to get the most for your barrel, so you want to make sure you're going to a market that won't be constrained. So we'll talk about the risks of Cushing being constrained going forward, and we'll go down that path and look at some of the pipes and some of the dynamics of that. So switching over to the map view, and as you can see, I'll just draw a little bit here. To tell this story and to look at the potential constraints coming out of Cushing, you need to probably talk about what production did in like the 2015, 2016 to 2019 timeframe. So back on that last slide, we showed that the spread between Cushing and Houston blew out during that period several times. Why was that? So the first thing to note was you had a lot of production coming from a lot of different areas. So you had production increases in the Powder River, in the DJ, and those pipes largely lead to Cushing. So you had production increases here, dumping more and more oil into Cushing. You also had Western Canadian volumes increasing, and those came over and fed mostly Midwest refineries, but a decent chunk of them also ended up in Cushing via some of Enbridge's pipelines, Flanagan South and Spearhead. And you also had really the straw that broke the camel's back in 2018, 2019 was Permian production coming this way. Now, Permian production would prefer to go down to the Gulf this way, but because of the massive and fast increases of production in the Permian here in 2017, 2018, and into 2019, new pipelines were not able to come online in time. So you ended up filling all the Gulf Coast pipelines, and the incremental barrel ended up having to come up to Cushing. And that really put a bunch of pressure on Cushing. It really dumped a lot of supply into Cushing. And what you ended up with was just nowhere to push that barrel. So just filled storage up and really caused some pressure on prices in Cushing, which caused that blowout. So we can take a look at this. Let's take a look at that step by step. I'll clear this out, and we'll take a look at all of those pieces. So the first one we'll look at, let's take a look here, will be, like I mentioned, Colorado, Wyoming, and Oklahoma supply production. So these are EIA numbers, so I'm just using the state numbers reported by EIA historically, and this time period is 2016 to 2019. So as I mentioned, you had growing supply in some of those Rockies basins coming across and going into Cushing. This quantifies how much that supply was. So in 2016, before the price blowout between Cushing and Houston, you had about 900,000 barrels a day combined for Oklahoma, Colorado, and Wyoming production. And this is production that, as it increases, is largely going to end up in Cushing. So as time went on and as we got into 2019, you saw almost 500,000 barrels a day of production increases. And most of that ended up in Cushing, Oklahoma. So from Cushing, Oklahoma, certainly there's a demand market in that area. There's some mid-continent refineries, but a lot of those barrels have to find a home somewhere else, and ended up filling pipelines, getting out of Cushing eventually. We'll switch back to the map view really quick, just to illustrate that a little bit. We can look at what Pony Express flows did during that time period. So let's click here, and you can see from like 2016 to 2017, Pony was running 280,000 barrels a day, 260,000 barrels a day. By the time we got into 2019, it was running mid 300s, so almost 100,000 barrels a day of extra production was flowing down Pony Express. And some of the other pipelines increased during that time too. Saddlehorn had increases during that time frame. I believe White Cliffs and Grand Mesa also had increases during that time frame. So again, the production increases here in the Powder River, and then in the DJ were flowed down to Cushing, adding more supply to Cushing. The next piece we'll look at is Western Canada, and this graph that you see here is a little bit misleading. Look at the y-axis here. I did start the y-axis at 2 million barrels a day, but this is a lot of production. So it may not look like a huge ramp up, and it really isn't in terms of percent-wise. It's not a huge ramp up, but the actual net amount of oil coming out of Western Canada increased significantly. So if you look at 2016, let's call it a little bit over 3.5 million barrels a day on average of production. Maybe 3.6, 3.7 on average. By the time you got into 2019, you were at almost 4.5. So quite a bit of increase there, almost 1 million barrels a day coming down out of Western Canada. And I'll switch back to the map view, and I'll clear this out so we can illustrate that a little bit. One of the main pipelines that ended up coming down was, let me clear everything. Obviously, a lot of that's coming down the Enbridge main line here. A lot of it ended up here in Illinois and fed these Midwest refineries in the area. And I'll just flip on the refineries really quick so you can see those, the gray dots. But a lot of it ended up going to Cushing and then eventually to Houston area. But if you see the flows here on Flanagan South, you can see back in 2016, 400,000, less than 400,000 barrels a day. Certainly increased a little bit, not a huge increase, but certainly a little bit of an increase you can see as we got into 2019 there. So more volumes from Western Canada. Most of those stayed in the Midwest, but some absolutely did make it down to Cushing and added more supply to Cushing there. And the last piece to kind of illustrate this, like I said, is like the straw that broke Cushing in 2017 and 2018 was the Permian. So you can see Permian production, and again, this is a graph just from 2016 through the end of 2019. And this is just EIA data. I'm using all of Texas and all of New Mexico, so it's not all Permian production, but this is mostly going to be Permian oil. The growth for sure is Permian oil. So starting in 2016, you're at maybe 3.5 million barrels a day. By the time we get up to 2019, you're at over 6 million barrels a day. So 2.5 million barrels a day. And if we just take a look, I'll switch back to the map view. I'll clear this out. So most of that did end up going down into those Gulf pipes. So you had pipes like Cactus One, some of Enterprise's pipes that over to Houston, and caught most of that capacity, and most of those flows were able to go into those pipelines. So most of that increased production ended up going to the Gulf. The problem was you ended up filling up those pipelines before pipelines like Cactus II, before pipelines like Epic could come online, which were new pipes that ran to the Gulf. So in 2018 and 2019, you ran out of space to the Gulf, so you had to go to the next best option, and that was the storage market at Cushing. So if we look at Centurion, you'll see a huge ramp there when you can tell exactly where the Gulf pipelines filled up. And you can see in 2018 that huge ramp into 2019 where Centurion was taking a bunch of extra barrels once those Gulf options filled up. Those new Gulf pipes did come online in mid-2019, toward the end of 2019, so you see this drop back down as pressure was taken off of Cushing, because that Permian production could go down the new pipelines to the Gulf. So we could look at these combined, and I think it's interesting to look at these combined. So these are, let's actually back up a minute. Before we looked at these combined, let's clear this out. What happened, and I'll switch back to the map view here. What happened to all this production that was coming from the Permian, all of it that was coming from Western Canada, and then the stuff coming down from here? What ended up happening to those barrels that ended up in Cushing? They can't just sit at Cushing. Certainly there's some refineries in the area that probably took some barrels, but these barrels have to end up somewhere. They don't just sit in Cushing forever. So back in the 2018, 2017 timeframe, there was really only 3 southbound Gulf options out of Cushing. Now there's a lot of straws out of Cushing. There's lines that go north to some of the, again, I'll flip on the refineries. And if you just take a look at my cursor, there's certainly lines that hit up all these mid-continent refineries in Kansas and Oklahoma, these southern refineries in southern Oklahoma. There's lines that come over here to the Panhandle of Texas and hit these. There's a couple lines that come up here to the Midwest to feed those. So certainly those are areas that you could push product through, but really you need to be able to get that extra supply to a more liquid market, and that more liquid market is the Gulf Coast, where it has much higher refining density, bigger refineries, more refineries, and then you have export options here, so you can open yourself up to the global market by getting those barrels out. So in the 2018-2019 timeframe, with all that supply at Cushing, there's really only 3 options to be able to get your barrel out of Cushing to the Gulf Coast market. And those options, we'll just go over those really quick. Seaway, owned by Enterprise, a joint venture owned by Enterprise, and Enbridge, 50% owned. Flip the totals on here. So as you can see, let's call it 200-ish barrels a day of extra of space open in 2016, and then as we got into 2018 and 2019, you see the volume spike considerably, spiked enough to where Enterprise was able to expand the pipeline from 850,000 barrels a day to 950,000 barrels a day. They did that with drag reducing agents, and I believe they made that a permanent expansion with a horsepower expansion. So the number that they quote now for that capacity is 950,000 barrels a day. But you can see that did hit capacity, and that's why you saw, one of the reasons you saw the price spread between Houston and Cushing widen was because this pipelines and others filled. And we'll look at the next southbound pipeline, Keystone and MarketLink. So that's going to be this. A much more profound ramp than what you saw with Seaway. So a lot of the incremental barrels that went into Cushing ended up going into MarketLink. And they did, based on my analysis, expand this pipeline twice. They expanded it from 700,000 to 750,000, and then they did another expansion. I saw it quoted at 800,000 on their market-based rate authority application that they put to FERC in 2019. They did flow 820,000 roughly in this time frame, and right around now they're flowing that too. So I have the capacity set at 820,000. We'll talk about potential future expansions in a little bit here. But yeah, a couple small expansions on that pipeline. And again, it filled. So that's why you saw the price blow out like you did. One other option, smaller option, but I think it's worth looking at. Let's clear all these. Red River Pipeline. So this is a pipeline. It's a JV from Delek and Plains. And if you look at the flow point here, so this one's interesting, and it's a misleading chart. So the thing you need to understand about this pipeline is it is a JV for Delek and Plains, but the portion from Cushing to Hewitt, which is here, that runs here, this is an undivided joint interest where Valero owns a chunk of this. So back in 2018, when the pipe capacity was 150,000 barrels a day, Valero owned, I believe, 60,000 barrels a day of capacity on the undivided joint interest. So you might ask yourself, hey, you told me the pipelines were full. The pipelines were full out of Cushing. Why wasn't this actually moving more? And the issue is the capacity here is absolutely, or was absolutely 150,000 barrels a day. But a lot of those barrels were being left here at Hewitt to get to Valero's refinery here in Ardmore. So this was full, this section was full, and this section had some opening space just because you didn't have a direct link to Cushing. And that remains the case today. So you may look at a chart like or a graph like this and say, oh, they actually have space. They actually don't, at least not directly on this pipeline, because there's about 60 to 70,000 barrels a day that gets left in Hewitt and ends up going over to Valero's Ardmore refinery here. So this effectively was full or close to full in this time frame, and you can actually see it looked like Valero was choosing to not take some of those barrels, and they were shipping them south instead, probably getting a better spread by doing that back for a few months in 2019. And if we look at this combined, so I'll switch back to the slide I brought up mistakenly earlier for a moment. So this is if I stack all the flows, which are in dark blue, the block dark blue, for these three pipelines I just talked about. So it's going to be Seaway, MarketLink, and Red River. The capacity is in orange, and then I overlaid the price spread between Houston and Cushing. And as you can see, just a note, the orange line is a nameplate capacity. The fact that you see blowouts sometimes where the line isn't, or the flows aren't exactly touching the line is probably due to constraints like we just talked about, like upstream or downstream constraints, the fact that DRAs are being used, the mix of type of oil in the pipeline can lead to lower or higher potentially capacity. So this is a nameplate capacity. So a good rule of thumb is like when the flows get pretty close, like what you see in 2019, certainly what you see in 2019 on this graph, when those flows get pretty close to that line is where you start to see price really break a little bit, and you start to see potentially a lot of pressure on that market like Cushing here. So yeah, that's the combined piece of it. And I think it's worth looking at. So if you just let your eyes go to the right on this graph, it's worth looking at where we are today. Where we are today, if you were to just look at a graph like this, is a potentially scary situation. We aren't that far off from that orange line, meaning there is the potential for some maybe price pressure on something like Cushing, on somewhere like Cushing. If we were to not get more capacity, or if we were to somehow get more supply into Cushing, that could get a little bit closer, and potentially we could see a blowout at Cushing. So let's look at the graphs again. I'm going to switch back to the map view, and we'll look at these pipes again. I'll clear this out. And we'll go into whether we should worry about Cushing potentially seeing some price pressure going forward. So if we look at the flows again, what's different today are a few different things. So number one, there is still a decent amount of space on Seaway. So Seaway does have space up to capacity is 950,000 barrels a day. Some of that may be with DRAs. So you might see the spread increase a little bit before they implement those DRAs, depending on the mix of oil in the pipeline, the constraints on the pipeline. You might see this. You might have to see Cushing weaken a little bit, maybe to the $2 versus Houston price, to be able to hit that 950,000 barrels a day capacity. But there is still some space available there. If we close that out and we'll look at MarketLink today. So MarketLink is effectively full today, which is a little surprising to me, but it appears to be full at least back toward the end of 2024. I would note with this, I mentioned earlier that they noted an 800,000 barrel a day capacity on their line, on the MarketLink line with their FERC rate application, market-based rate application in 2019. They also noted in that application that they could take this pipeline up to 990,000 barrels a day with DRAs. I don't think that they implemented that expansion. They may have. I can't tell if they actually did that. It doesn't appear based on the flows that it's ever gone above 820, so I'm going to assume that they haven't done that yet. But it appears that they can take this pipeline even further if they need to. Now, could that happen with the snap of fingers? No. Could it happen within a few months? Potentially, yeah. So that's one area where if we were to see increased supply into Cushing and we needed more flows on a pipeline, Seaway would be the first one I would expect to get it, but MarketLink via a low capital expansion could potentially be the second outlet for that. Red River, which we talked about earlier, probably a little bit of space here. I would note that like around 70,000 barrels a day of this space is being used for oil to go into Valero's refinery here. So this is a misleading chart. There isn't that much space. Now, to the extent that they can find another line to get oil down to Hewitt and then push it through this line, that's a possibility. I know One Oak has a line that runs close to here from Cushing. That's potentially something that they could do. But there isn't a lot of space, I don't think, on Red River. There is one more pipeline that we should talk about, one more southbound egress option to the Gulf that came online after the last blowout. It came online a couple years ago, and excuse the fact that there's going to be a lot of pipes on here. I have them all combined into one system. But this is ETP crude. So what you have here is, and I'll draw this, make it look a little bit easier. You have this line, which is the old Centurion line. So Centurion used to run it's run a few different directions, but most recently it ran from the Permian area up into Cushing. Energy Transfer did reverse one of those lines down to this station, and then they're pushing oil here down their Granite Wash system. And let me switch back here. Down into Permian Express pipeline. So I'll show that here. So that's the route of that. And if we look at flows that are coming down out of that, as you can tell, they had 70,000 barrels a day of capacity. They did up that. There is a little bit of space potentially on that system, but it looks pretty full. And these are a lot of volumes. They have a joint tariff with White Cliffs, so these are DJ volumes coming down. A lot of these volumes, but yeah, they're taking this route. This is a route that didn't exist back during the last blowout. So some extra southbound capacity that we should factor in. And I should note on my combined slide that is factored into the capacity out on that combined slide. I do have this system factored in there. So another thing that's a little bit different and really, let me clear this out. If we're thinking about, hey, the scenario potentially looks a little bit dicey. It looks, and I'll go back to the combined slide. I think it's worth looking at again. So where we are today looks pretty close to where we were back in 2018 and 2019. Should I be worried? I don't think you should be. So one of the things to think about is just from a production standpoint. So we'll go back to the map view. Production today, I'm not worried about production significantly increasing with oil prices where we are today. So oil prices around $60 a barrel. You're not going to see significant production really out of any basin. You could talk me into maybe a little bit out of the Permian, but certainly other areas, you're not going to see significant production increases. Western Canada potentially over time, but those are long-tailed expansions that you can kind of factor in. I wouldn't worry about significant production increases. It's not like it was in 2018 where the Permian was going bananas and everything else was growing like crazy too. So you aren't going to get a lot of production increases in $60 environment. Now, if we were to go to over $80, yeah, let's think about this and think about the risk to Cushing. One of the other reasons I don't think you should worry too much is the Permian. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, the straw that broke Cushing's back in 2017 and 2018 was the Permian filling on those Gulf Coast pipelines. So these Gulf Coast pipelines filled, and they had no option but to shove their oil back up into Cushing. So if we were to look at that, what that looks like today, those southbound options, not all of them are full. I know there's been some expansions that have been talked about, and even FID. These are small expansions to the Gulf. I think those are fine, but there is still space, at least today, on some of these pipelines. So let's take a look at some of them. So existing pipeline bridge tax is a good example. Certainly you've seen a significant ramp up in volumes there, but they still have, let's call it, over 100,000 barrels a day of space on that pipeline as of end of 2024. Even a new pipeline, which is moving just an impressive amount of oil, Wink to Webster. So certainly appeared to hit capacity in early 2024, but even today that has at least a couple 100,000 barrels a day of capacity open at the end of 2024. So the Permian and these Gulf Coast pipelines, they aren't full, at least as of the end of 2024. They aren't full yet, so they can handle some more Permian production. You have some expansions coming online there. So we're not in an environment where the Permian's going to lean on Cushing very much going forward, at least not in this price environment. Other reasons to not worry too much is, let's use an example here where, let's say Cushing it does get a little bit more supply and it does get constrained. It has more squish around outlets than what it did in 2017 and 2018. So to illustrate that, let's look at this pipeline. This is BP's pipeline, BP1. And if we were to pull up the flows on this has space. So in an environment where Cushing weakens, this pipeline can move more volumes to the Midwest to get them out. Now, you might question me and say, hey, what good does that do? Like, they had space in 2017, 2018, 2019 when the price blew out and they didn't increase flows there. And you're absolutely right. But this Midwest market is also different. So the thing to think about with Cushing is kind of connected to all the major areas. There's a lot of straws out of Cushing, a lot of pipes out of Cushing, and it can push a lot of oil back. It can push a lot of oil around. So in a scenario where Cushing weakens to, let's say, $2 to $3 discount to Houston, you would see potentially more oil come up this pipeline and feed Midwest area refineries and demand markets. Ozark's another good example. We can just bring that one up quick. There's not a lot of space on Ozark, but there is a little bit. Ozark's another pipe where you could certainly shove some more barrels down there. Now, what's the balance here? Because you can't just shove more oil into this Midwest market without displacing some oil somewhere else. So let's pull up ETCOP. It's a good one to look at. I'll pull up DAPL too. We feel like we talk about these pipes a lot, but they're huge balancing pipes for the Midwest, so they're really important. So if you look at the flows on DAPL, flowing 600,000 barrels a day, let's call it, a lot of that's actually left in the Midwest. So a lot of that light oil is left in the Midwest, and is left proof that it's left is ETCOP's only flowing 300,000 barrels a day. So over 300,000 barrels a day of flows on DAPL are being left in the Midwest. ETCOP could take some of those down to the Gulf instead. So in an environment where Cushing weakens, some of these Midwest refineries, instead of taking barrels off of DAPL and ETCOP, would probably source the barrels in Cushing and move them this way. And then you would get a weaker price environment in the Midwest, which would incentivize more barrels to come down ETCOP here. So that's the pull. And I think it's worth noting too, if you click on this, look at what ETCOP did in 2019 when those prices blew out. ETCOP had no more room to push more barrels down its pipe in 2019. Again, another one of the reasons why Cushing blew out. There was no way to squish around more oil. There's a lot of extra capacity on ETCOP today, so you can squish around the oil a lot better that way today. Another area where you can kind of let's call it derivative market that's tied to Cushing, where you can get some push-pull to relieve some pressure off Cushing, is going to be Capline. So this pipeline used to move oil north to get to these Midwest refineries. So imported oil would move north, and you can look at the flows here. These are northbound flows on Capline. Through 2017, this flowed north. It now flows south. So they've reversed this pipeline and has 300,000 barrels a day capacity, which can be expanded significantly. This is a huge pipeline. It could go over a million barrels a day of southbound capacity. But for now, it has about 150,000 barrels a day of extra space on it. So in an environment where, let's say, Western Canada is moving more barrels, I'll draw here. Western Canada is moving more barrels here. If they were historically going this way, there is enough interconnected capacity, I believe, in this Illinois market to instead if Cushing's really weak, you're not going to move that to Cushing because Cushing may be oversupplied, and if Cushing gets $2 to $3 weaker, you would push those to Capline instead, and then they'd be able to come down Capline, which would relieve stress or relieve supply off Cushing there. So that's another way to squish around barrels to where Cushing doesn't have as much pressure put on it. One more pipe that I would like to mention that I think is worth mentioning. I think it's kind of far down the list of like emergency valves, but there is a direct line, Diamond Pipeline, another pipeline that's co-owned by Plains and another partner, but this time it's Valero. So this pipeline is basically exclusively used for moving Cushing volumes to the Valero's Memphis refinery. This was marketed as a potential project to dump into Capline. So I'll bring that up here. So there's a pipe, technically two pipes here, known as the Collierville pipeline. Right now, Collierville takes oil off of ETCOP and moves it to Memphis, not very much. Memphis now gets most of its oil from this pipeline, Diamond Pipeline. But in an environment where Cushing becomes super constrained, for some reason let's imagine a scenario where we have huge production increases, and Cushing becomes constrained for whatever reason. This would be something where you could move some volumes over. It certainly has space on it today. This capacity could be doubled with pump stations, the Plains has said in the past. So you could certainly increase the capacity of this line, and then as we noted earlier, there's almost just a lot of capacity, potential southbound capacity on Capline that they could feed this into. And just I don't have the pipe on this map, but there is a connection here called the Collierville pipeline between these two pipelines, so they could get the volumes there. So I guess to sum up, I would say I think I wrote an article in 2017 saying Cushing needs another southbound pipeline. I don't think I fully appreciated like the amount of kind of relief valves that you have out of Cushing via these derivative options that I just went over. So again, to sum up, I guess I would just say I don't expect there to be significant risk, especially in a $60 price environment, a significant risk of Cushing detaching from that Gulf Coast price. I think you'll continue to see a $1 to $2 discount there. And under that situation, I think that I stand by like the netback analysis that we did that says, hey, if and you don't want to tie yourself to just one option, but if you're a big producer and you're looking to ship, I think Pony and Bridger is a fine option to push into Cushing. I think it's probably your best netback option at the prices that we displayed. Certainly DAPL could lower their prices slightly and then take the lead on that. But that's, as it stands with our analysis, that's the way I look at it. So I know this one was a little long, but I like talking about kind of complicated, constrained markets like Cushing. And maybe we'll do another deep dive on Cushing in the future. There's other things to talk about. There's tons of pipes out of here. I didn't even touch on even close to all of them. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope it was helpful to understand Cushing and understand potentially the risks of prices behind potential price movements between the spread between Cushing and Houston. Everybody have a great week. Thanks for joining.